So hi there everyone, I'm here feeling a little bit between Cody Johnston and Aaron Bastani because I'm making a quick emergency video to respond to some current events. So, the Prime Minister of the UK, Boris Johnson, has prorogued Parliament, which means he's closed it for a bit, stripping parliamentary oversight at a key moment in order to force through what appears to be a damaging, hard Brexit or no-deal Brexit plan. People across the country are responding to this with anger, and rightly so. It is an affront to the notion of British democracy that our legislature should be suspended at a point like this, when so much of our national fate seems to hang in the balance. Some even go so far as to call this a coup. But is that what's happening? Is this, as Stephen Fry has called it, a very British coup? So the answer, in my view, is no. This is not a coup. But that answer should not put your fears to rest. Rather, it should make them worse. While a coup may be a terrifying prospect, it maintains the comforting idea that we have a functional democracy, and that therefore the solution is, by our efforts, to try and force a return to the normal functioning of our democracy, and strike out this aberrant deviation. But this idea is a myth. We do not have a fair and functional democracy, and this is not an aberration to our constitutional settlement. It is simply business as usual, if under quite extreme circumstances. What it shows is not that our democracy has been disrupted, but just how paper-thin our claims to democracy are in our constitution. Let me try and explain why. Part 1. Our constitution. So, firstly, to show this is not a coup, we have to look a bit at the UK constitution. So the UK does not have a written constitution, which in itself, in my view, is cause for concern, and certainly makes it a lot harder to examine it. So the way our constitution does work is from sources. These sources include common law, that is the legal history of judgments in the UK courts, statute law, that is whatever is passed by the legislature through Parliament, and conventions and other documents, ranging from rules of parliamentary conduct to Magna Carta. All of these amount to a record of the precedents for political action in the UK. It's also guided by certain principles, the most important of which is generally held to be parliamentary sovereignty, which basically puts statute law, the Acts of Parliament, in a position of primacy in our constitution, subordinating both the courts and other constitutional sources to it. This is one of the reasons we do not really have constitutional courts in this country that are able to overturn government decisions in the way that they can in places with written constitutions like the US and Canada. And even the Human Rights Act only allows courts to make advisory decisions to the government, which the government itself doesn't have to follow, as we can see from the fact that they were told by the courts in 2004 that by the Human Rights Act, prisoners in the UK should have the vote, and yet no action has been taken. This effectively means that if Parliament passes something, it is de facto constitutional, as parliamentary legislation is the primary source of the Constitution. So in the end, what this effectively means is that Parliament can do what it likes, even up to overthrowing democracy, as democracy in the UK is only a constitutional right insofar as Parliament has itself legislated for it. And no new Parliament is bound by the one before, so our democracy is entirely contingent on the will of our rulers to continue it. So this clearly shows how the British Constitution does not in fact block Parliament from, well, anything. In my view, it's basically an invitation to tyranny by Parliament, if Parliament so wishes. But I hear some of you cry, this is not Parliament, but the executive, the government suspending democracy.
This is not Parliament, but the executive, the government suspending democracy.
So is that not a coup? Well, this is a debatable point, but you could say that by having the sitting days before and after this closure of Parliament, as the government are arguing, Parliament still has oversight and can, for example, call a vote of no confidence in the government if it likes. And given that the executive is drawn from Parliament, this basically means parliamentary sovereignty is still maintained, You could also argue that this is an overstep by the executive, but the problem is, in an unwritten constitution, in any unprecedented situation, it's not clear what the limits are. So yes, this could be debated. But another thing to consider is, given the way that precedent plays into the constitution, if Johnson's government tries this and succeeds, as it looks like they will, then it is essentially a precedent, and therefore would be constitutional unless outlawed by an act of legislation later. Basically, in practice, this means anything the government or parliament can get away with basically becomes automatically constitutional. But I hear you say, that sounds like a ridiculous structure, not like the politics of a fine, upstanding, democratic state. And you'd be right. But our system was never intended to be a fine, upstanding, democratic state. Part 2. Our system. A very liberal democracy. Our democracy has been, from the start, constructed not to maximise the rights of the common people, but to allow them to the minimum degree possible to prevent the population from rising up. In short, our democracy has never been meant to work for the benefit of most people. This is well illustrated by the words of Charles Earl Grey, tea aficionado, and celebrated as the founder of British democracy for his 1836 Great Reform Act. In passing this act, however, he made his intentions by it pretty clear. If any persons should suppose that this reform will lead to ulterior measures, they are mistaken, for there is no one more decided against annual parliaments, universal suffrage, and the ballot than I am. My object is not to favour, but to put an end to such hopes and projects. But why would the rulers of our society want to constrain democracy so much? Well, obviously power corrupts, and money too, but there is more to this story than that. And to look further at this, it's important to point out that the democracies we practice in most Western countries are known as liberal democracies. Liberalism is often hailed as a bastion of human rights, civil liberties, and of course, democracy. However, if we dig a little deeper into the philosophical underpinnings of the liberal system we live under, we find for many liberal thinkers that these values can be very easily superseded by another value, which liberalism places in the highest regard, that of private property, which foundational liberal thinker John Locke calls the end of government and that for which men enter into society. But he's not just talking about personal possessions. The ownership he defends extends to the ownership of land and industries far beyond what one person can work, which needs therefore a poorer, unpropertied underclass to be made to work it, so that the owner can profit from it through their labour, at least under capitalism. This was used not just to found the modern industrial society where bosses have domination over their workers, and we must note that even though in our society we pay lip service to political democracy, our workplaces, the institution that many of us interact with most in our day-to-day lives, are profoundly undemocratic, and rarely even claim to be. But this has also been used to defend land grabs from indigenous people in places like America and Australia by claiming they had no legal ownership over their land because they didn't use it in the right way or had no written deeds, and even to owning labour itself in the form of slaves, something which Locke himself personally practiced. This defence of property required that the poor be denied full access to political rights, lest they be tempted to try and reclaim their fair share of land or property from the rich. And remember, the richest families in the UK have not really changed in the last 1,000 years, so to call this wealth fairly gained or meritocratic is kind of a stretch. For this reason, the defence of property, and thereby the defence of capitalism, is acknowledged by liberalism regularly to be at odds with democracy. And so liberal thinkers from Mill to Hayek have all discussed how to curtail democracy in order to protect this structure. And we can see a great example of this in the words of Mill himself. There is a majority of poor, a minority who, in contradiction, may be called rich. Is there not a considerable danger lest they, the poor majority, should throw upon the possessors and the larger incomes an unfair share or even the whole of the burden of taxation? We can see the results of this in the way that governments over the last 40 years have prioritised spending cuts for the poor and tax cuts for the rich, resulting in a massively growing wealth divide in this country and many other countries around the world. Or in how, since the massive growth in state provision in this country in 1945, much of government action has been aimed not at building on these systems, but at undermining and dismantling them. Privatising industries, eliminating union rights, and, especially today, trying to undermine the public support for even the most beloved of our social institutions, the NHS, or National Health Service for any non-UK viewers who don't know what that means. Most seriously, this will to protect private property and the profits of business has left our governments utterly unable to deal with the existential threat to our society that is climate change. It's clear that any serious action to address this catastrophe in a serious way would require rapid action against the interests of powerful industries, especially the coal and gas industries. However, as we see in the weakness of our global response, our liberal capitalist societies have been unable to suspend their desire to defend the profits of the super-rich, even when the survival of our societies, if not the species, is at stake. Of course, in this case, no-deal Brexit does go against the interests of some parts of the ruling class. However, given that the government is clearly seeking a Brexit which would erode rather than enhance the protections people get in our society, be it rights in the workplace, safety standards on products, or the right to move freely, not to mention the transparency laws on tax that they are trying to avoid, we can see that, for the capitalist elites at least, even in this case, the project does in the end come down to protecting the interests of a certain faction of the rich, even if there is another faction that disagrees with them in this case. So, as I said above, this is not really a coup. It's just the system functioning really as normal in order to allow the government to do effectively whatever it likes to protect its own interests, even to the point of suspending democracy, which, again, Parliament, in our constitutional system, can absolutely do if it so chooses, without breaching the Constitution. In fact, to do so would effectively write democracy out of our constitutional framework because of its insistence on parliamentary supremacy. So I think by this point we can all see that this is an unsustainable system, and that this prorogation of Parliament by Johnson's government, while not really a coup, highlights some of the fundamental flaws in our democratic model. So what needs to change? Part 3. What can we do about it? So, clearly we need some pretty serious constitutional reform. And for me that would include at the very least a written constitution and functioning constitutional courts, as many other Western countries have. However, the problems of our democracy are not unique to the UK, and even in a firmer constitutional system, it is still possible to do awful things. And we still see a situation where the government serves the rich and not the poor. The US, not just under Trump, but under pretty well every president since 1945, can serve as an excellent example of this. When the undemocratic underpinnings of our system are so clearly on display, as they are in this situation, we should not just demand a return to the undemocratic norm, or even to the norms of other liberal capitalist nations. We should forward radical alternatives and demand a true democracy. Many in the UK complain about our first-past-the-post voting system, which is a voting system that favours the powerful, and they advocate instead proportional representation, or PR. And while I think this would certainly be an improvement, I think we can go further. I mean, Germany, for example, has some degree of PR, and yet has not solved these problems that we're discussing here. So, what would it be to go further? What would a true democracy look like? Well, one thing to consider is that in our current system, we don't vote on issues, but on personality. We elect an MP, but once elected, they have pretty much unlimited power to vote how they want. As many would say, really all we have is the power to elect our own dictators. Even party manifestos are in no way binding, which we could illustrate with a range of cases from across the years, but of course is most clearly exemplified in the 2010 election, when the Liberal Democrats reversed almost their entire policy platform in order to jump into bed with the Conservatives to gain power.
But they did get a 5p charge on plastic bags in exchange for, cutting disability benefits.
Yeah, they did do that. Thanks, Blue. So instead, what if we actually voted on policies and politicians were bound to the decisions of their constituencies? This is often called direct democracy, where we as people are able to influence the course of our political world. There are some existing liberal examples of this, for instance in Switzerland, where they enact some direct democracy through a system of regular referenda. However, this still leaves leadership which asks the questions and a public which is simply able to say yes or no, and where a simple majority often wins. So, is there another way to carry this out? As anarchists and socialists, many of us have a different idea about how direct democracy would actually be put into practice. We believe that direct democracy should be achieved by the radical devolving of power, empowering people to make decisions at the level of the workplace and the community through local direct democratic councils. And these councils ideally would not just have to vote yes or no on proposals from on high, but these councils could be used to spread information and have real debates, so that people working together can make genuine informed decisions on the issues that affect their lives. And hopefully seeking more than just getting a majority vote yes or no on a single issue, but to achieve consensus so that a practical solution can be found which suits all parties involved. This requires the radical democratization of our workplaces and our lives, but would give people the opportunity to make properly informed decisions on all the issues that affect their lives. Any oppressed class or minority would be given the protected right to oppose or block their oppression, as it would be impossible to achieve consensus without them, and any would-be dictator could be shouted down by any member of the group without fear of reprisal. This is to me what an effective democracy would look like, and while we might not achieve it immediately, I think it's a worthwhile value and system to work towards. But of course, for this to really be a true democracy, we have to address the big elephant in the room: capitalism. While our system still permits a minority to accumulate wealth far above the rest of society, there will always be power in money and property, and thereby the ability to buy votes and influence, and even to buy the means to spread false information, as we see to a great extent in our current time. Also, you can never really speak up to your boss in a workplace without fear of reprisal, if their power and wealth gives them the right to decide your future, and whether you keep your job, and ultimately, thereby your means of survival. Your democratic rights are pretty limited when someone has the power to deprive you of your livelihood if you use your rights in a way that they object to, as is the case with employers under capitalism. And therefore, to secure a real democracy, we must ensure both equal access to the means of survival and even of luxury, and by the same token, end the mass accumulation of wealth by an elite few. This means providing universal support to everyone, sharing the profits and ownership of workplaces and industries, not only as a guarantee to quality of life, but to ensure everyone has an equal say in how our society runs, because no one has the economic power to buy votes or deprive fellow humans of their needs or luxuries in order to enforce their political will. Essentially, we must end capitalism if we want to realise the promise of a democratic country and a democratic world. This is not something we should wait for the powerful to deliver to us. As we see in the case of Earl Grey, reforms from above are often designed not to offer a solution to the problems of the people, but to create the illusion of one. But we can take this right for ourselves by organising in our communities and workplaces, and doing so under direct democratic principles to build strong, organised networks of people who are able to take part in the mutual organising of their own lives, rather than simply take direction from the powerful as we are so often trained to do in our current society. By this means, we can build the solidarity, autonomy, and human connectedness that will allow us to resist attacks on our democracy from on high, like the one that Johnson's Tory government is currently perpetuating. And, in the end, we can build a better, freer world, a true democracy, where the will of the people is not subsumed into the selection of dictators, but is freed to make informed choices in the interests of people, so we can finally set about building society so that it works for everyone in the best way possible, and build a world that serves the people and the planet, not power and profits. So thanks for listening, everyone. I've written this script very quickly and made this as a 2-camera video, just because obviously this is a developing situation and very current, so I wanted to try and get this video out quickly. So I hope you enjoyed that. It's not something I've done before, but maybe it's something I'll do again in the future. And if you're not convinced by this video, or you'd like to know more, then you can look at my series The Dark Side of Liberalism, which goes into these ideas in much more depth, and which I recycled some of the quotes from here. So check that out if you haven't seen it yet. On that note, I'd like to add that since I recorded this video, Johnson has hinted that he would oppose any legislation that tried to stop him leaving with no deal on the 31st of October, and this would be a direct opposition between the executive and Parliament, and that would be a breach of the Constitution and a constitutional crisis. In fact, to the best of my knowledge, it would be the biggest standoff between Parliament and the executive, and thereby one of the biggest constitutional crises since the standoff between Charles I and his Parliament, which led to the English Civil War. So, there's something to look out for. Anyway, I'd like to thank Baphometix for providing the music for this video, and Blu Legender for doing the original graphic design and animation, as well as probably doing a lot of the editing on this video because I'm going to be away for the weekend and we want to get it out quick. And if you've enjoyed this video and want to see more videos like this, why not consider supporting this channel on Patreon? You can do so for as little as $1 a month, and it helps me to eat and pay the rent. And of course, the more of you donate, the more videos like this can be made, because I will be able to devote more time to this and less time to working. And on that note, I'd like to thank my current patrons: Carly, Natty, Peter Benzoni, Revelo, Zabesian, A Wingless Monkey, Baffy and Kit, Becquerel, Brett Long, Dan Wheatley, Das Martin, Eden Harris, Geshtin, James Dirtka, Jason Rajamogan, John, Mr. Awesome Be Cool, Rain, Rory, Everybody Talks, Some Random Geek, The Cooler Noah, and Thought Slime. So I think that's just about everything for now. I hope to have part 2 of my Where Next for the Left series out very soon, so watch out for that. Until then, have a great time. Bye!